Alright, how's this look? I feel like it's giving Dark Universes presents Magnum PI. The Silent Hill 2 remake has finally been unleashed, and based off of initial reactions, it seems like it's going to be video games' answer to The Godfather, in that it will be the most common answer given to what is your favorite X of a given medium by aficionados. And I'm right there too. I've adored Silent Hill 2 for ages. It's long since been a member of the ever-rotating quartet that makes up my favorite video game, the top slot to which seemingly depending on the time of day and the position of Venus. When I was originally brain-vomiting topic ideas out for this channel, I planned on focusing the Silent Hill 2 episode around the prospect of a feature film. I've always found it hilarious that the live-action Silent Hill movies went from adapting the first game straight to the third. I guess it's kind of logical in progression in the sense that if you're familiar with the story, you know that the first Silent Hill's business with all of the cult shenanigans is largely eschewed in the second game and then resumed in the third. But it's still hilarious because the story of Silent Hill 2 is universally regarded as the best of the franchise, maybe the best of all video games, to the point where it would actually take an enormous amount of effort to make a bad version of it, so the filmmakers skipping this particular entry reeked of, we didn't want to be held to the standard of having to make a good movie, and we would rather make... It's even got 3D in the title, just so you know it's going to be terrible. I also wanted the opportunity to refute this point from Ben Yahtzee Croshaw, formerly of Zero Punctuation.
So if Silent Hill 2's story and character make up for dodgy gameplay, why couldn't it just have been a book, or a film, or a zoetrope rather than a game? Because what it does best, and better than any other game I know, is atmosphere, and that wouldn't work as well in an uninteractive medium.
Yachts, what the hell are you talking about? Non-interactive mediums do atmosphere all the time, especially films. Why do you think people keep dragging their asses back out to the theaters even after all of the post-COVID advancements in distribution? It's because being in that space enhances the atmosphere. Waking up one day and realizing that they may have one of the greatest games ever made in their copyright catalog. They also announced that in conjunction with this remade Silent Hill 2 game, they would also be moving forward with a Silent Hill 2 movie adaptation. And hey, check out that title, Return to Silent Hill. That's not bad, it works on two levels. The film franchise is returning to Silent Hill, but also the plot proper starts with our protagonist, James Sunderland, receiving a letter from his wife, Mary, who's been dead for 3 years, and posthumously imploring him to find her in the titular town, which was their vacation getaway spot before it got all monsterfied. And then I watched the announcement trailer.
We are looking this strange world entirely through the point of view of the hero we were playing.
The producers and Konami into this adaptation. Christoph, it's really somebody that respects the work that has been done, but that also has his own vision.
For me, one of my major goals in this film is how to redesign the classic monster of Silent Hill. I was talking about Red Pyramid, you know, this big guy with the helmet, you know. He's, again, in this one. Some of the creatures of the film of back in 2006 were very, very appreciated by the fan. But in the same time, for me, it was important to come back with surprise.
Okay, remake of the video game it is then. First and most obvious question, which one gooder? Depends, a lot of factors. But the TLDR, if you've never played it before and you're just wondering which to pick up for the overall better Silent Hill 2 experience, new one wins. Heresy! I get it, I understand. I get that the remake wouldn't exist without the original. And I would even go so far as to say that if I was pressed, the original is, strictly speaking, better art. But, based off of the impressions that everyone's given, I think that it's fair to say that this remake has done an admirable job at letting a new generation play through an accurate version of Silent Hill 2. And I think the reason that it's succeeding is the exact opposite reason that the film looks like it's going to be an absolute cinematic septic tank. That being, Bloober Team clearly got what Silent Hill 2 was. This isn't just a beat-for-beat port of the original 2001 game. There are all kinds of touch-ups throughout that truly add to the total package. They still haven't managed to solve the obnoxious, obtuse, pace-shattering puzzles that crop up every 30 steps, which is my biggest issue with the game and the reason I can't state confidently that it clears my other 3 contenders for all-time fave. But things like the combat are a marked improvement for the Ludo narrative. No longer do fights feel like stun-locking a trash mob until progress is allowed to be reached. Now, every encounter feels like a pitched struggle for survival and retaining sanity, aided in no small part by Luke Roberts' phenomenal voice work, throwing this wild, frenzied scream into every take, but in a way that's actually pathetic and desperate rather than staged and sexy. There's also innumerable tiny world-building changes that continually demonstrate the team's effort to not only replicate, but amplify the essence of James' story. And it's one of those world-building additions that I want to focus this video on, now that I've abandoned all hopes of the movie being any good. God damn it! Real quick, I've tried thus far not to spoil anything story-wise about Silent Hill 2 or its remake that you wouldn't have already gotten just by reading the back of the box. However, going forward, I'm going to have to consider some of the overarching plot stuff, so if you haven't played one or both yet, and you want to go in blind, now'd be a good time to jump ship and paddle back after you've finished. After some exploring in the town, James finds not his reincarnated spouse, but instead a roving cavalcade of violent nightmares. And eventually, he also finds her. This is Maria. Does that name sound eerily similar to that of James's late wife Mary? That's not even the half of it. Maria is a spitting image of Mary. Not as in long-lost sibling spitting image, but is the same person kind of spitting image. With the one exception of being all tatted up and dressed in a way that one would describe as being conventionally sexy/slutty from the male gaze. The game's not just being pervy, it's actually integral in understanding James's character. After some calamitously awkward introductions, James and Maria take refuge from lurking monsters in a sleazy local motel. I told you, that's on purpose. Before they can hunker down in one of the rooms, the motel's courtyard is designed in such a way that the player can't help but be funneled towards one of these red squares that they'll recognize as an in-game object that they can use to save their progress. And here's where it gets mental. Saving the game brings up this menu and pauses the diegetic time. Or at least, that's what I thought it did.
James? Is everything all right? Hey, you okay? It's like you froze for a second.
Yeah, it's fine.
The phrase mind-blowing gets overused a lot these days to the point of being basically meaningless in the same way that epic or awesome is, but I don't really have another way to describe this. In the same way that the original Silent Hill 2 redefined my expectations of what emotions an interactive experience could elicit, this detonated my entire concept of the relationship between player-character and player. But before I can really get into what I think this beat is, I need to scratch out a couple of things that I think that this isn't. Number one, it's nothing. Occam's razor would suggest that this exchange is nothing more than what it appears to be. Just a couple extra bits of dialogue slipped in to run a small, uncanny chill down the player's spines. I'm sorry, do you know what game you're talking about? This is Silent Hill 2, the game that has more allegories than it has lines of code. Even if that is true, it's just boring as all hell. And we here at Talking at Trapezoids never pass up an opportunity to pretentiously overanalyze media. Number two, it's Maria. It depends on what you mean. If you mean that this is proof that Maria is a real person because she can glean a couple of UI elements, then no. I know that trying to ascribe somebody a trait like being real or alive is a nebulous and fickle term here in Silent Hill, but still, no. With the highest degree of certainty available, Maria is absolutely a manifestation of James's tortured psyche. Her whole deal only works if she is the monkey's paw inversion of what James erroneously always thought he wanted Mary to be, in a be careful what you wish for type parable. Also, Maria just shrugs off getting bifurcated by Pyramid Head at one point, so I don't think her realness is what's being hinted at here. If, however, we do some shoe and foot flipping and ask if this may instead be proof of the very opposite, that Maria's being able to bend the meta-narrative is a slight tip of the hand to players that Maria may in fact be all in James's head, I do think this is what the intended subtext was. I suspect that if you were able to find the developer that scripted this scene and ask them point blank what it meant, and you were able to get an honest answer out of them, the answer that they gave would look pretty similar to the clues and conclusions we just drew, but I'm certainly not above burying authors, so let's move forward knowing this is probably how it was designed, but also that the designer has the incorrect interpretation of their own work. Because when you apply enough scrutiny to the details, it blows past the narrative parameters set up by the rest of the game. Which is a bold statement, I know. Silent Hill 2 features some pretty mind-bending levels and stages, but importantly, always retaining a diegetic cohesion. Nowhere else do we see Silent Hill 2 deliberately calling attention to itself as a video game, in order to mess with the player's head or otherwise. As a great counterexample, look at the relationship between Walker and Conrad in Spec Ops: The Line. It is very obvious in the final showdown that Conrad is talking past Walker and directly to you, the person holding the controller. But this fourth wall breaking has been going on for the entirety of the game. And that works for Spec Ops. Obviously, I love that game too. But it and Silent Hill are trying to tell two very different stories. Spec Ops is built from the bottom up to be a critique of the rampant hyper-violence in military shooters. Silent Hill 2, on the other hand, is absolutely a character piece. The narrative exists within its own universe and tells its story without dipping into our universe. Maria is never meant to be Deadpool, and you can even tell by the way that she talks to James.
Hey, you okay? It's like you froze for a second.
To me, that reaction sounds like confusion, not omniscience. Well then, if Maria only exists as a fragmentary personification of James' fractured mind, then obviously this moment has to belong to... Number 3, it's James. Again, I have to disagree, or rather, I disagree based on how I assume most people would assert this premise. For almost all the same reasons that I discounted Maria as the originator of this meta-acknowledgement, James also isn't poking holes in the artifice of his reality. He still exists within the world of Silent Hill 2. Likewise, he sounds equally unsure as to why he just froze up for a couple of seconds in the middle of a motel parking lot. Now yes, James is both an unreliable narrator and clearly not being entirely truthful with either Maria nor himself, since he doesn't acknowledge her as just an apparition. But here's an example of where James is being dishonest.
I'm sorry.
Don't be. I told you. I wanted the pain to end.
Yeah. You did.
Now compare that lie and its associated implications with the thought of James secretly harboring knowledge of his own fictional existence. Let me put this to you another way. The big revelation that we discover in Silent Hill 2 is that James Sunderland suffocated his dying wife Mary because he felt trapped and deplorably horny. The revelation is not that James comes to understand his place in the multiverse as a mere video game character. That would be a very, very different kind of experience. For contrast, let's look at Bioshock and specifically the face-to-face confrontation with Andrew Ryan. Bioshock is deliberately using its hyper-consciousness of being a game to comment on the illusion of choice. Alright, then who or what could possibly be causing this gash? In reality, there's no one else in the scene. Well, yes, there is. There's you. But wait, you interject. Aren't you playing as James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2? Why, yes, you are playing James Sunderland, but you yourself are not James Sunderland. A subtle but profound difference that can only really be understood through the lens of persona. No, not that one, the Carl Jung thing. That's the one. Now, Carl Jung is not the final word nor the grand arbiter of psychology. No one is. Psychology is a science, by definition a never-ending continuum of learning. But I still find this type of old-timey psychology a really useful way of decoding narrative art. Since Jung and his contemporaries were attempting to craft a singular unifying model of consciousness, it ends up working really well with fictional characters who are specifically designed and distilled to tell a purposeful story, as opposed to real people, which is why the plurality of psychology practice today focuses on the practitioner actively listening to the patient and helping them in their own journey of healthful self-discovery. Now, this is the most comprehensible model of Jung's hypothesis of the self, and you might notice some similarities right off the bat between this and Freud's model of the relationship between the id, the ego, and the superego. But what Jung extrapolates on is taking those exclusively internal elements and adding in external social relationships as well. There's a lot of crap on the board right now, and Jung gets even squirrelier once you start adding archetypes into it. But all we need for today is these two sections here, the persona and the shadow. The shadow is what Freud would probably refer to as the id, and is composed of the anima and the animus, which are not important for us to differentiate right now. Believe it or not, I've actually been trying to cut back on tangents. The shadow is our innermost selves, or perhaps it'd be more accurate to describe it as the self that interacts most with our inner world. The yin to the shadow's yang is the persona, the part of ourselves that interacts with the outside world, predominantly other human beings, but not exclusively, and this is often metaphoricalized as the mask that we wear when engaging with society. Armed with this knowledge, let's return back to that zero punctuation retrospective on Silent Hill 2, because there's a curious part in there that I've never been able to quite verbalize my feeling towards until now.
It's mostly just you, James, in a big cold haunted town. And after a while, you start to wonder which one of the three is James's biggest enemy.
Well, now that's strange, I thought. I've never really considered before that my relationship to the character whose mind and body I'm possessing for the duration of a video game session might actually be adversarial. And I don't think that this relationship often is antagonistic in video games. In fact, developers usually try to go out of their way to align the motivations of the player with that of the character. When I'm playing Legend of Zelda, both Link and I want to beat the snot out of Ganon. Silent Hill 2 is definitely a different beast. James having snuffed the light out of his bedridden spouse to go and goon over some candy stripers is hopefully not aspirational to many of the potential audience members. But more importantly, it's also not a goal. It's already happened. Mary is already dead when we decide to step into the shoes of James Sunderland. Our goal as the player of a video game is to push forward, to overcome the obstacles that the game presents to us and see the narrative through to its conclusion. It's James, specifically the shadow self version that wants to wallow in his guilt. A guilt that conjures the malicious spirits of Silent Hill. Not just Maria, but those very obstacles that we, the player, are attempting to overcome. And where it all clicked for me was that it was another fragment of James's mind who first verbalized it. Whenever the player touches one of these red squares in the game to create or overwrite a save file, we can see a shadowy reflection of James seemingly looking through that red square directly at us, playing the game. But it's not until Maria comments on this curious introspection that it gains any diegetic presence. Once I noticed this dichotomy, oh man, the floodgates were open. The Silent Hill games all have different endings based on certain player actions throughout the game. It is the player serving as the persona, interacting with the outside world for that character that determines the ultimate denouement. But then I thought, hang on a second, this doesn't even need to be so explicit as a choose-your-own-adventure ending. Every frame that we are actively playing the game is filled with micro-decisions and choices. Everything from what weapon we equip, to when we heal, to when we reload, even even what direction we walk around the buildings in is dictated by the whims of that persona player, some of which play a part in determining the ending you get, but the vast majority of which exist only in that moment-to-moment gameplay. But then, my brain exploded, that's not even restricted to Silent Hill 2, or even the Silent Hill franchise. In every video game, we play a character that we are hijacking all of their interactions with the outside world. In every moment of active gameplay, that is always the relationship between the persona player and the shadow character. And even further beyond, it continued to derail, we as the persona player are very rarely, if ever, given the true universal freedom when acting through that character avatar. The parameters by which the persona can interact with the outside virtual world are set by the shadow self of that character's possible realities. Therefore, the mask of persona serves not only as director of interactions with the outside world, but also as a quantum filtration system. To which I replied, okay, you've probably had enough caffeine for today. He's right, though. Do I attempt giving a lecture explaining the entirety of string theory in a video game essay on YouTube?
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
In the broadest possible strokes, there's this thing called the observer effect. It's got a few different practical meanings depending on the field that it's applied to, but in quantum mechanics, it basically means that waves exist in a quantum superposition until they are observed, at which point they come to rest as a particle. You ever heard of Schrodinger's cat? This is the basic idea that thought experiment is very poorly trying to illustrate. Since the observer in the effect is a sentient consciousness that decides when to observe the wave and settle it into that reality, there is a suggestion that each decision made by the conscious mind creates a fork in the timeline, resulting in two divergent universes. Some of them are radically different, some of them are trivially. We're pretty far off the deep end already, and I'm going to try to reel this back in for the video's time's sake. But if you want to check out some other media that tackles this a little bit more directly, there's the episode of Doctor Who titled Blink, there's also the season 2 premiere of Rick and Morty, and there's the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, which uses quantum mechanics for some of the most interesting fight scenes in modern cinema. That's also stitched together with a completely unrelated and overrated bickering family squabble with all the grace of JonTron making a turducket. Ow! Heresy! When we look at our Jungian shadow character through the lens of string theory, their natural state is as the unobserved wave, existing in a quantum superposition until the player persona makes a decision out of all of the possibilities available. That then solidifies for the character what their actions and interactions are going to be with their outside world. Maria didn't specifically have to comment over James creating a save file in order to evoke this same effect, but I find it a curious coincidence that she did. Of all the different forms of interactive narrative, I've always thought that the act of creating and using save states was a really fascinating hurdle to overcome for the immersion of any computer-operated experience. Because there's nothing the game can feasibly do to affect the memory of a human being that is playing it, that player ascends to a fifth-dimensional consciousness relative to the quantum subnet of realities within that digital universe. Furthermore, because all video games are some form of executable file, players not only hold the power of decision over choices offered to them by the rules of the game, they hold the ultimate power of opting out of any choice that they have created in the universe that they are currently observing, by either reloading a save or re-executing the program as a whole. They can escape any permanent consequence of their choices by removing their persona from the observer state of that shadow character variant while remembering what choices caused that sequence of events to occur. Some games have tried to mitigate this paradox in various ways. Roguelikes are a good case study, as by default they are the genre most cognizant of this discongruity. Almost all roguelikes erase a certain degree of your progress with each failure, attempting to make each death feel more punishing and permanent. Although this is still only an extrapolation of the already existing system that most games employ, that sends the player persona back to the last checkpointed save file upon each death of that shadow character variant that they were controlling. Roguelikes then attempt to add on top of this time and progression penalty by giving each separate life or reality of that shadow character certain procedurally generated, aka semi-randomized elements, such as which power-ups you receive or where enemies are spawned. And while you can replicate an exact reality by re-entering that universe's seed into the part of the program that determines the procedural generation, I'm starting to feel more and more that from a narrative perspective, forcing this fragmentation of consciousness to align might be the wrong direction entirely. Don't misread my analysis as condemnation here. I love me some roguelikes, and I've had hundreds of hours of collective fun with the genre. But the consciousness ascendancy of the player over the games they are playing grants them the ability to enact impermanence, not enshrine permanence. Ludo-narratively, I'm finding it more and more interesting when embracing this imbalance rather than trying to circumvent it. I can also see why the vast majority of fourth wall breaking characters are comedic. As soon as your character begins to acknowledge the dimensional rift that allows for an audience to be told a story, it shatters the window into that world and makes immersion really hard to take seriously. But James Sunderland's world has already been shattered by the time we're given the opportunity to occupy his persona. While a good handful of stories have attempted to incorporate their interdimensional status literally into their storytelling, I'm having a hard time thinking of anybody else who's used this reality revelation for dramatic effect. Animal Man is probably the closest, though as masterful as Grant Morrison's run was, it still hits very different. I love that run, and I mean no disrespect, but no matter how many times you turn to this page and Buddy Baker exclaims that he can see you, he can't really. Nothing you do on your side of the ink will change the remainder of the events for Animal Man, nor his reaction to them. James, however, you can. You can control how he moves through this world. You push him forward, you choose if he heals and how, and you control whether or not he's saved. Now that's some shit you can only get with an interactive medium.